This is the Building Automation Monthly Podcast with Phil Zito, episode 81. Hey folks, Phil Zito here, and welcome to episode 81 of the Building Automation Monthly Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be discussing what a building automation system server is. As I was sitting down and going through the massive list of topics I have that I could cover, I was thinking about what is something that pretty much every building automation system person uses every day, whether you're a technician, whether you're operating a building. And then I started to think, well, what could I talk about that would be something that everyone would touch every day, that would benefit everyone if I went really deep into it. And so what I decided on was the building automation system server, because this is kind of the brain of everything that happens within a building automation system. See, this is one of the areas that I was actually kind of surprised that I got a lot of questions about this in the IT course that I put on. And one of the students in my course was asking some really good questions around virtualizing existing BAS. And then what would it look like if that BAS was a much older BAS? And how would he approach virtualizing this BAS server? And I started thinking about this and I realized, man, there are a lot of variables at play. And maybe I'm just too close to building automation systems, especially the servers and the APIs and things like that. And because of that, while I'm like, oh, this is simple, I don't remember what it was like before I was working on this stuff, day in and day out. And it wasn't so simple to me. And that's what I want to get across in this episode. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to dive through the server fundamentals. We're going to talk about what servers are. We're going to talk about architectures, how they work, how they, being servers, work with building automation systems, what kind of servers there are. We're going to talk about different types of hosting of servers, and we might even dive a little bit into virtualization. So I know that's quite a bit, but I think this is pretty timely, especially with some organizations moving their BAS servers to the cloud, some organizations getting rid of BAS servers and actually going and putting all this stuff in field controllers and supervisory devices. So let's dive in. Now, what I want you to understand is that at the beginning of this episode, I'm going to talk through some things that may be a little foreign to you, depending on how long you've been doing building automation systems. What I don't want you to do is disconnect, to be like, oh, well, I don't understand it. Because I promise you, by the end of this episode, we will circle back and it will all make sense. So let's dive in at what we really all should know around building automation systems servers. All right. So the first thing is, what is a server? And I mean, how is a server different than just a regular computer, right? Because oftentimes when you talk to IT guys and you talk about servers, they envision these rack-mounted servers, these, things that look nothing like a desktop or laptop, and they slide into a rack, which is basically where you contain all of your IT gear. And they sit there and that's it. But from a building automation perspective, I'm sure for some of you who have been in the field for a while, you've seen servers under desks. You've seen servers on laptops. You've seen servers sitting in a closet somewhere, really dusty old closet that no one even knows where it is. So we want to separate the concept of a server being some physical thing and really talk about the functionality. The main purpose of a server is to process client requests. Now, we'll dive into what a client is in just a second, but when I say processing client requests, here's what I mean. When you go onto your computer, when you go onto your phone, what's happening is you are doing a whole bunch of things at the same time. You've got an operating system that is running your phone, running your laptop, running your desktop. It is then creating a graphical user interface. It's processing inputs from your mouse and from your keyboard, and then it's sending those as maybe outputs to your monitor or outputs through your network interface card. But the key thing here is that this desktop environment, this client environment, that is specific to one person. Now, a server, on the other hand, is meant to process multiple clients, as I said earlier. So its purpose is to run an application, to run some sort of functionality, and then serve that functionality to the clients. A real good example of this is if you were to go to google.com. You type in google.com in your web browser, and what you're doing is you're connecting to a web server. And that web server is serving up data, mainly web pages, in the form of google.com, and it's serving them up to your client, your web browser. Now imagine if every single person had to log on to a Google server, and that Google server had to create a user interface, had to process inputs and outputs and all sorts of stuff from every single person. I mean, millions upon millions of people. That would have to be a beefcake of a server, right? Well, that's why they serve up little snippets of information. So if you go and you type in google.com, you get what's called an HTML file, hypertext markup language. And that basically formats the text you're getting back from the server. So it serves you up a very small request. And over time, servers have gotten super efficient at serving up these requests. Now, here's the deal. With building automation systems, you have multiple different types of servers. And we'll dive into those a little bit later in the podcast. But the thing is that you have these servers and they serve up data to the client interfaces. Now, this whole process, this whole architecture is called the client-server architecture. You can have multiple clients connected to a single server, and this server then serves up data. Now, notice we haven't talked about building automation systems yet. We will. But in the past, you had what were called thick clients and thin clients. Thick clients were, if you used an Allerton building automation system and you had to download the Envision for Backtalk software and you had to install it on your client computer, and then you would connect to the server or you would connect to the BCM modules via that Envision for Backtalk client software. Or maybe you had a Siemens or a Johnson Controls system or a Tritium system, and you're using some form of Java application run engine or a jar file. And that created essentially a whole client environment. It created the graphics, it handled all the transmission of data to and from the server. That was called a thick client because it was something you had to download, something you had to install, something that then was dependent in order to run. Now you have, as of lately, you have these things called thin clients, right? And thin clients are like web browsers. And basically what it is using a common, Google Chrome, Mozilla Firefox, Apple Opera, Internet Explorer, whatever. You then go to a website and you do a request, and then the server sends back your user interface in the form of a web page. That's been one of the biggest shifts. There's been other shifts like virtualization and separation of operational contexts. What that means is like microservices, things that you really don't need to know and it'll just boggle your mind and it's like overwhelm, right? You don't need to know that. And honestly, I'm not even sure why I brought it up if you don't need to know it. But in all seriousness, so you've got these user interfaces on these thin clients. And that's one of these huge shifts. Because now you've got building automation software being shared in web browsers, and that has a bunch of ramifications. One, it eliminates thick clients, which then allows you to not have dependencies to Java, to not have dependencies to the client operating system, like, am I running the right version of Envision for Backtalk with Allerton or whatever similar other BAS? And you now can do everything through the web browser. Now that's kind of cool. It's definitely not mature as far as the building automation space goes. I mean, we're pretty immature in using web browsers. I mean, we don't do our configuration tools in web browsers. We don't do our programming in web browsers. There's a ton of stuff we don't use the web browsers for. We still use dedicated applications. But we have made great progress. Now, what does this have to do with building automation systems? Why am I talking through all this? Because as a building automation professional, whether you're in sales, engineering, design, consulting, operations and maintenance, you should understand what the building automation server does and what the ramifications of different deployment models, different architectures, things like that have to you as a building automation professional. So the first thing, right, is a physical server with a thick client. We've already talked through that, where you run a thick client on your server, on your client, and it connects to the server. Now, this is well and good for older environments. Problem is that a lot of times this client software is dependent on a form of Java or dependent on an operating system or some sort of framework, some sort of service that runs on the client computer that, if updated, will break the client. That was one of the biggest things back, in the early 2000s when you'd install a BAS. You'd worry like, uh-oh, is IT going to patch or upgrade the Java because it's going to break my user interface? Now, you don't see that so much with the newer architectures, but that was one of the problems. And that's one of the problems for a lot of operational folks and a lot of folks who are doing upgrades. Because you're like, oh man, I'm going to upgrade the BAS. And you're like, oh crap, this client doesn't run on Windows 10. It only runs on Windows 3.1. And now I upgraded everything and it's all broke. And I can't roll it back because I can't find a 3.1 computer. So I'm screwed. And I've seen a lot of that in the past. I've personally done that in the past. That's why I'm speaking from painful experience. Now, in the case of a building automation system, there's really three main types of servers that you utilize. And those servers are database servers, application servers, and web servers. And really, if you think about it, those carry the three main kind of parts of an application framework, right? So in an application framework, what that means is how an application is constructed, essentially the Lego pieces, right? Like the red, yellow, and green Lego pieces that come together to form something. Well, what you have with building automation systems is you have an application, and that's going to process data from your supervisory devices. That's going to store data, store trends, provide kind of global level logic, potentially APIs and integration. And then you have the visualization layer, right? And that's the web server, and that's going to connect to the application server and allow you to visualize and interact with the data in the application server. And finally, then you have the database server, and this is your historical archive. This is where trends get stored. This is where database schemas, that's architectures and standards, get stored so that you know how your BAS is structured and the data from the historical performance of the BAS. And that's all stored in the database server. So you get these three kinds of servers, and each one of them has their own nuances, right? When you think about it, in an ideal world, you would have a separate server for each one. That would provide the greatest level of redundancy. That would provide the greatest performance. But the real world is that a lot of BAS folks, they're not IT experts. They don't understand exactly how they're supposed to go about performing a BAS server installation. Like they don't understand, how am I going to go and install my database on one server, my application on another server, and my visualization on a whole nother server. They don't understand the three aspects of that. So what you'll often get is all three kind of server pools or application pools put onto a single server. And that can be okay. That can be fine for some sites, which, you don't have a lot of load. You don't have a ton of users. You don't have necessarily the IT support to support 3 different servers. But as you start to scale up, as you start to get to larger sites, as you start to get to sites that are geographically dispersed, meaning sites that are across the US or across the globe, then this is where this becomes a major pain. Plus, if you ever want to virtualize or move your servers into the cloud, having everything on the same server also creates a pain, and it's a single point of failure. Now, I'm going to talk through kind of how to mitigate that, different architecture strategies and things like that a little bit later, but let's first dive into what each server type is. So as I mentioned, you have that 3-tier architecture, right? The applications, databases, and the web servers. This isn't to be confused with the 4-tier building automation architecture, which is servers, supervisory devices, field controllers, and inputs and outputs. That's the 4-tier BAS physical architecture. This is more of an application logical architecture. This is how the applications kind of piece together. Well, first up, you have applications, right? You have the BAS server application. This may be a Metasys server. This may be a Tridium Web Soup. This may be, Siemens Desigo or Apigee or whatever the heck goofy name they have right now. And that is running the application. It's running the functionality that then is going to both communicate to the database server as well as provide data to the web server. Next up, you have the web server. And the web server is typically going to run on like either an Apache or an IIS, that's Internet Information Services platform. And what that's going to do is that's going to essentially have what are called resources. They're HTML pages typically. And those resources are going to be served up to your client. You're going to type in like the IP address or the DNS name of the BAS server, and then it's going to allow you to log in. It's going to handle authentication. Then it's going to serve up web pages based on your requests. Oh, you click on this part of the building. Well, it serves up a web page for that along with the appropriate data. Then that web server is going to handle the kind of back-end communication to either the application server or the database server, depending on what you're trying to do. Next up, and kind of finally, you have the database server. And this is where you store all your data. This is kind of where you take everything and your historical trends, your usernames and passwords, your alarms, your actual user data, that kind of stuff. It's all stored in this database. Now, there's 2 main types of architectures, as I mentioned, right? You have the consolidated everything on one platform. And in this case, this may be an actual tower, like what I have sitting next to me as I'm recording this podcast. You may actually have a blade server, which if you don't know what a tower and a blade server are, then just Google it. Just type in blade server or CPU or computer tower, full-size tower, mid-size tower, and you'll see images on Google Images, and it all makes sense real quickly. But essentially, you could have it stored in some sort of kind of physical device, and that physical device may have server-level components, meaning a server-level processor, server-level memory, motherboard, etc., or it may have basic desktop-level components, like just a regular desktop processor. The big difference there between server components and actual desktop components are that server components tend to have multiple CPUs, tend to have multiple network interface cards, so they can actually go and segment off different computer resources to different applications, whereas a desktop machine doesn't tend to have that. So when folks say, Phil, when should I get a desktop machine versus a server class machine for my BAS server, I often will say, well, how much are you going to use that BAS server? Is this an enterprise server? Is this a kind of physical local server for a single building? You can get away with a single building server, a small building, just using a desktop machine. But for multiple campuses, multiple buildings, you're going to want to use a server class machine. That way it has more resources, can process more requests. That's the big thing there. Which brings us to server hosting. And I want to add kind of like a gotcha, kind of something that I've seen along the way. If you ever go to a customer site and you get told that the BAS is really slow, the server's really slow, and you start to dig into it and you're like, when is the BAS server slow? And they're like, at night when the night crew's here, it's not really slow, but when the day shift's here, it's very slow. You're like, okay. Then your natural next question would be, how do you access the BAS server? And what I've seen in the past is folks directly connecting to the physical server and using the user interface on the server. And that's a big no-no. See, remember the whole kind of perspective of a server is to serve up resources. It's not to create user interface environments. It's not to process inputs and outputs. Yet a lot of folks directly connect to the server and they log into the physical server and they're using the BAS server, multiple people at the same time, and then they're wondering why it's slow because it's having to render like 4 or 5 user interfaces for these people who are directly connected into it. So if you're running into that, if you're running into where your server's slow, and this is something I dive much more deeper in the IT course where I start to get into how to analyze logs, how to set up kind of trackers to make sure that your devices are performing. But assuming your devices aren't at capacity, your components aren't at capacity, what I mean by that is memory, storage, CPU. Assuming those are all fine, then usually what it is multiple people physically connecting to the server at the same time. All right. With that being said, let's talk about the 2 main types of server hosting. So you have local hosting, which is pretty straightforward, right? You stick it either under a desk, which I don't recommend because think about this, right? Think about this. This building automation system server is potentially running your entire hospital, running your entire airport, the air, potentially the lights, potentially the access control, depending on what you have integrated. And you've got it under a desk in a facility office where someone can bump their foot against the UPS or against the surge protector and accidentally knock the server offline or accidentally bump into it and spill coffee on it. And there goes your whole BAS, your whole interface. Yeah, your supervisory devices will keep running. Yeah, your field controllers will most likely keep running. But then you've lost your graphical interface. It's ridiculous. You should never, under almost any circumstance, put a BAS server out in the open where someone could plug a USB drive into it and hack it, where someone can bump into it, spill coffee on it. That's just bad practice. If you are doing that right now, I highly recommend you just work with your IT group and you get a IP jack in a closet somewhere and you just put your server in there. I really recommend that. 1, it's going to make it much more secure. 2, you're always going to know where it is. And 3, it's going to really increase the likelihood that you're not going to accidentally shut it down, which I've seen multiple times. I've been on multiple service calls for, oh crap, I spilled hot chocolate on my server. Or, oh crap, the server power supply burnt out. Or the electrical outlet shut down or something, and we don't have EM power. All sorts of stuff. So if you're going to locally host BASs, just be aware of making sure that server's in a redundant environment. Next up, there's cloud, right? And cloud is where you host your building automation system in the cloud. And there's a couple different providers out there nowadays who are actually providing dedicated cloud hosting for BAS. And it's kind of funny to me. 1, that I didn't think of that idea, because I like to think I'm pretty entrepreneurial, but I didn't think about that. And that is a really good idea. I question how long that idea will be practical, because think about it. I mean, eventually you all are going to get IT knowledge. You're just going to have to. Otherwise, it's going to be like the pneumatics guys who just eventually just faded out because they didn't have that technical experience to work with DDC systems. Well, it's going to happen whether you like it or not. You can complain, you can stick your head in the sand, you can say, no, I'm going to be fine, but eventually you're going to go the way of the dinosaur. You got to learn IT. But here's the deal. Here's the really interesting point is that, so this whole premise is like, hey, we're going to cloud host your BAS. And if you don't know much about cloud hosting, essentially what they're doing is they're going to like Azure, which is a cloud host, or AWS, Amazon Web Services, which is another cloud host provider. And what this company that provides quote unquote BAS hosting is doing is they are buying what is called, they're essentially, what is the word I'm looking for here? Oh, they're essentially leasing out stuff that they're leasing out. So they are buying space. They're buying a couple machines from Azure and they're leasing those. And then they are essentially slotting you in there, either giving you a dedicated machine or a piece of a dedicated machine. And then they're upcharging, they're adding margin to it. And it's kind of crazy when you think about it. They're probably making 50 to 70% profit margin. One, because no one's doing this right now. Two, most BAS folks don't know how to price IT services. They don't know, is it reasonable for me to pay $199 a month for a 4-core machine, or is that not reasonable? They don't know how to go and use the Azure price calculator or the AWS price calculator. And that's not a dig. That's just the reality. I mean, those tools are complicated. If you don't know what you're looking for, if you don't understand exactly how machines are built and what 4 cores means versus 2 cores, then you can find yourself in a situation where you're spending money because you don't understand what a least cost of a system should be. So you should always involve an IT group, if at all possible, when making these decisions. However, so there's cloud service providers who will provide that hosting for you, or you can go direct to AWS or Azure. You can lease a machine, and then when you lease that machine, you can then go and set it to be elastic, which means if it gets a lot of service, then it'll expand, it'll increase its web resources, essentially, its CPU, its memory, dynamically. Or you can go and just get a static machine, and if you see that your resources are being eaten up, then you can expand. I know we dived a little deep on that, probably a little deeper than I really thought I needed to go, but I just kind of wanted to provide a perspective about what that looks like, because I feel to a lot of folks, just based on conversations I've had and just kind of the general feeling I get, is that the cloud is mysterious to a lot of folks. It's kind of vague, it's nebulous, but in reality, all it is someone else's data center. It's just a series of a bunch of machines that it's like a land in Florida filled with timeshares, and you're buying slices of capacity. That's essentially what a data center is, and they're located all across the world, all across the US. Now, there's pros and cons. Local, like I said, you have to physically maintain it. You could fail and not have rollover options. Cloud, you don't have to physically maintain. However, you're going to be permanently paying because you're most likely going to be paying monthly. You're also going to pay a little more, but you're going to have redundancy. The cloud data centers, I always kind of chuckle when folks are like, I don't want to put it in the cloud. Cloud's not secure. Or cloud's not reliable. I'm like, cloud is way more reliable than 90% of the physical installations I've seen. And folks will be like, well, my BAS has been in a closet and it's been running for 10 years. I'm like, okay, that's great. That's your BAS. But I've been to plenty of service calls where that is not the case, where they get a flood, they get a power bump, they get all sorts of stuff, and the computer won't boot up ever again. So you're really gambling when you have on-site physical installations. And if you're worried about cloud reliability, cool thing is you can use what's called a load balancer. And what that is that basically you'll host your BAS in 3 different data centers. And then based on where you're requesting data from, it will send it to the fastest connection. And if one of those data centers were to go down, then you could immediately switch over to the other data centers. And you wouldn't have to do anything. It would do this automatically. But here's the deal. The thing is that a lot of folks just have these misconceptions. They think the cloud's insecure. The cloud's likely way more secure than you because they have one goal, and that's to be secure and be up. And you have multiple goals. So I'm willing to bet the cloud's way more secure in most cases based on the auditing it has to go through, based on the performance criteria and SLAs, service level agreements that they get held to. So if it feels like I'm pushing the cloud, if it feels like I'm like, hey, cloud, I don't have any stocks in the cloud, at least that I'm aware of. I just think it's a very reliable structure. I think it's a very easy way for you to deploy building automation systems fast. and I think it's very reliable. So I really encourage folks to do that. Alrighty. So as I said, we talked about all sorts of aspects of BAS servers. And this was kind of a 30,000 foot flyby. Like I said, I definitely go much deeper in my IT training course that I provide. But I still knew that a lot of you out there were kind of hungry for this information. It was kind of this concept that was a little vague to a lot of folks, and I really wanted to kind of provide some solid touch points, some solid fundamental base for you to build on, for you to be able to have those conversations with IT or with your clients or with your BAS contractors around servers, around whether to use cloud, to use virtualization, to separate your applications, those kind of things. I really wanted to give you those tools, whether you're in sales, design, technical roles, doesn't matter. You can use this information. All right. So that is it for this episode. Like always, you can go to buildingautomationmonthly.com/81. Once again, that is buildingautomationmonthly.com/81. I'll have a bunch of resources for you there. I'll have some stuff around Azure and AWS. I'll have the price calculators and the resources that you can look at. I'll also have a link to my IT training program. This is my online IT video training program that's self-paced. And I've done that specifically for a lot of you who are working projects, who have to learn on the fly, who have unpredictable schedules and can't physically go to a course. Not to mention there's no courses out there that physically teach everything you need to know about IT. But with that being said, I created this course for you all. It's open until August 18th. So depending when you're listening to this, that's August 18th, 2017. After that, I'm closing the course until January because I've got other stuff I need to work on. Now, this course, like I said, self-paced, online, and you also get a coaching call every other week where we hop on GoToWebinar on Tuesday nights, and you're able to ask your questions if you can't make it, and I answer everyone's questions, and we have voice chats, and we really dive deep into IT concepts. So if you've ever wanted to learn IT, and you don't want to spend years doing it, and you want to know only what you need to know for building automation systems, then this is the course for you. And you'll see a link to that at buildingautomationmonthly.com/81. All right, folks, that is it for today's episode. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this. Your time is invaluable, and I am so honored that you spend your time with me. And if you've got any questions, if you've got any ideas on things you would like me to cover in future episodes, I'm just an email away at phil@philzito.com. So feel free to hit me up. And as always, remember to continue to push, continue to improve yourself, never be satisfied. I'll talk to you all again next week. Take care.